All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov at LevPo on Twitter, and we are here to talk about whether the Middle Ages were as bad as people make them seem or not. And today we have, for the very first time, Rudyard Lynch, aka WhatifAltHistory, recently fresh off his Danny Jones appearance, just like my main man right here, Neil, Gnostic Informant, always a mainstay of the show, always bringing that esoteric Gnostic lore. So guys, we're going to go right into it, starting with Mr. Lynch. Very, very interesting thinker. I've been taking a deep dive at your worldviews. And let's get right into it. What do you make of these Middle Ages? And of course, before we start, make sure to like, subscribe, comment in the chat, patreon.com/breaktherules. Anyway, Rudyard, you got the floor, buddy.
So I have a very important question to clarify here. Are we talking the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages? Because those are two very different things.
Dark.
Well, hold on. We should do this.
Let me speak. Let me finish the statement. Dark Ages is 500 AD, fall of Rome until the Crusades. The Middle Ages is the whole time frame.
It's not what it is. It's been.
No, let me finish my statement. If you don't let me finish, I'm going to leave. This is very important. Let me finish my statements. Okay. So the Dark Ages is the time frame from the fall of Rome until the First Crusade. The Middle Ages is the whole time frame from the fall of Rome until Constantinople. And so are we talking at the first 500 years or the final 500 years? Because those are completely different time periods, where in between from the first to the second one, you saw Europe's massive technological social progress.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. The second period of the Middle Ages was a much more growth. We have to go with where the term even came from to define it. You can't just make up your own dates. It's Petrarch. Petrarch is a writer from the 13th century. He coined the term Dark Ages. He specifically puts it between, he said, I guess you could say the fall of Rome, because he says it's a 500 to 1000. It's a 500-year span. It's very clean and easy. But if you want to use 476 to the First Crusade, it's pretty much the same. That's why I was just going to say real quick, let's just go with the term that was given by Petrarch, because he's the one who made up the term to begin with.
So Petrarch, his term is roughly fall of Rome until Crusades.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
That's what I thought we were talking about. Because I have two completely different arguments for the Middle Ages vis-a-vis the Dark Ages. So that's why I'm clarifying.
Okay.
So
we're on the same boat then.
Let's start the clock then. Okay, great.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so I find with most historical discussions, whatever you say about a certain time period, the opposite is also true. For example, with ancient Greece, it was this rational philosophic society, but on top of it, it also practiced slavery. It was dirty, religious fundamentalism. It treated women like the Taliban. So the Dark Ages, the thing we say about it is true, in that it was a period where urbanization stopped in much of Western Europe, where England lost literacy, where the government crashed. You lost construction abilities. That's also true. And there's a duality between civilization and barbarism, where that all happened. Yet at the same time, if we look at corpses and if we look at bodies of people in the Dark Ages, people were tallest in the Dark Ages of any time period between the birth of Christ and the Industrial Revolution. And so it's a time period where health was higher. Quality of life for the normal person was highest in the Dark Ages because you had a parasitic elite in the Roman period. And Peter Brown talks about this a lot in that it's an era of history where the fall of Rome had this parasitic, overly bureaucratic government that stole from the population. Thus, the removal of that caused an increase in quality of life. And so you saw this underlying trend where the broader macro-civilizational perspective, life got worse. But at the same time, on the individual perspective, it was the opposite. And implicit in the Dark Ages is the creation of the cultural formations that later became Western civilization. Where people often think that Western civilization dates back to the Greeks and the Romans. I don't agree with that, because if you look at the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church broke up the clan, thus creating the individual in the 600s, where if you read Italian documents from before then that time period, people are classified by their clan name first. Then after that time period, they became classified by themselves as individuals. And I've had authors like Joseph Heinrich argue that the creation of the individual, which occurred during the Dark Ages, is one of the most important events in history, because the West's ultimate trait is individualism. That's first thing. Second thing is that our moral code with Christian philosophy was determined by St. Augustine of Hippo. And St. Augustine of Hippo, he established so many of our philosophic concepts on free will, what's a just war, how a ruler should relate to a population. And much of our philosophy today is fundamentally Christian, even if we don't realize it. Other thinkers like Gregory of Tours and the fathers of the church, they established the framework for modern Western philosophy. And the Christian civilization that evolved into the West came out of the Dark Ages. So you have individualism, you have Christianity. Europe's nations came out of the Dark Ages. The English, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, they did not exist beforehand. They are a Dark Age creation. And so fundamentally, modern Europe comes out of the Dark Ages, because the Dark Ages, although with this period of decline and stagnation, it created these cultural foundations that allowed the institutions that became Western civilization to form. The parliament comes from the Norse Althing, which were the parliamentary associations of West Europeans, who these warriors would meet up and elect the nobility. The German Althing became the European Parliament. Western capitalism comes from the pirates of this time period. And the Italians especially, the Italians were doing a lot of trading in the Mediterranean in the Dark Ages. And pirates in both the Mediterranean and the North Sea, they are the evolution for the modern startup, where if you look at the structure of stocks or startups, it's based off the Dark Age pirates. And so this is my ultimate argument, where, yes, the Dark Ages was a period of civilizational decline. For the average person, life was often better. And then on top of that, although it was a period of not a lot of stuff going on, through it provided the social stabilization which allowed the later rise of Western civilization. In that, a Dark Age happening to a society can be the best thing that can ever happen to it. And thus, if your society gets completely pwned, it forces people to restart. And you look at China and India. China and India had incredible civilizations, and they never had that reset. It's the same society as the BC era. And thus, what you fundamentally see from that is that India and China stagnated, and that's what would happen if the Romans never fell. Europe would be China, and Europe would be China, and it would no longer have been able to form the creativity that allowed the later industrial, scientific, whatever revolutions.
All right, order from chaos. So, Neil, what are your thoughts there, buddy?
1 second. Let me just I just wanted to get an image of something and put it in this. Okay. So let me start off with saying that obviously I was mentioning how Petrarch in the 14th century was the person who coined the term Dark Ages. He's obviously rediscovering, and that, by the way, he's one of the people who's credited with starting the early Renaissance from his rediscovery of Cicero's letters. And he's looking back at all these ancient sources. He's looking back at Cicero. He's looking back at, Homer. He's looking back at all these classics, Aristotle, whatever. And he's looking at what was going on in this period between the last 500 years before we can go with the Crusade, with, that period. What was going on? Like, where's all the classical text? Where's all the advances in medical science? Where's all the advances in philosophy? What's going on? So he uses the term Dark Ages for that particular reason, not exactly health or logistics or economics, but more importantly, he's focusing on the culture, which you did also agree with, which is interesting. It's kind of a big deal, I think. So he develops this term, the Dark Ages, and they gives a span of 500 years. Platon, another pagan from right before the fall of Constantinople, was a hardcore pagan, hardcore anti-Christian. He's sort of like a proto-Nietzsche figure, and he's credited for the Renaissance for his writings being preserved by Medici, who starts the academy in Florence. And so they're going back to Aristotle, who is, basically perfects the system of rationalism. And we get the scientific method from Roger Bacon, but he's also using Aristotle to develop this. Galen's medical science books are not at all updated. So you get Galen in the 2nd century, who's updating Dioscorides, who's updating Hippocrates, who's updating these medical thinkers, these medical doctors of the ancient world. Galen puts that together, these volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of books on how to treat certain diseases, how to make certain drugs, how to mix stuff together, the Theriac, all that stuff. That book just basically sits there and is used throughout the Middle Ages, and it's hardly ever developed upon it. Barely. There's barely any advancements to there until the Enlightenment. People start to build on Galen. They're reading Galen. They're updating Galen. Architecture, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns. We get those from the Greeks. Mausoleums, sculptures, concretes developed by the Romans. Aqueducts brought water to cities. Roads connected urban cities for trade. All that infrastructure basically just stays there for the next 500 years and doesn't really get developed barely until the period that you and I agree when there's growth. Art, you get mosaics, paintings, frescoes. The early Middle Ages art is just garbage, I think. I mean, we're basically waiting until the Renaissance before things start to get better in the realm of art. And then religion, Hermeticism, Platonism, Orphism, Judaism, Christianity, mystery cults, Eleusinian mysteries, Samothracian mysteries, Phrygian mysteries, Oracle of Delphi, Oracle of Ammon, Oracle of Zeus at Olympia, Sibylline oracles, Roman imperial cult. You had options for what you're inspired by to decide what you wanted to believe in as far as spiritual beliefs and what gods you want to worship. Theater, comedy, tragedy, satire, dramas, monologues. Every major city had a theater. Those theaters start to go unused during the early Middle Ages. Music, the genres, dithyrambs, paeans, various modes like the Phrygian mode, the Dorian mode, the rhapsodies, psalms, odes, elegies, hymns, polyharmonic instruments, flutes, drums, lutes, harps, pipes, kitharas, lyre. That's it. We don't start to see new instruments or new developments in music. There is some. I'm not going to lie. There is some. You get like Gregorian chants. It's all in the church though. It's not like outside of the church. Logistics. Comparing the Roman army. The best test we can do to compare logistics. Look at the Byzantine army against the Persian Sassanids out in the desert, and they were running out of water and they had to retreat. Whereas the Flavians, the Vespasian and his son, who are out in Judea sacking Masada in the middle of the desert, they kept getting water and food brought to them easily, no problem. They could be there forever if they had to. Masada, the people that were in the fortress of Masada had an endless supply of water. I went there myself to look at their big ass, whatever you call it, pool they had there where they stored all their water. They could have been there for years and hold out. And the Romans were able to provide logistics and send water and food to the armies to keep them there in the desert, in the hot desert. And so they can build their siege warfare and get up there.
Any quick thoughts though on the question of the individual
I'm still going.
Sure. Go for it.
What are you talking about?
Go for it.
So sources, the Byzantine army in the desert. It looks like they're struggling compared to the Roman Empire armies. So back to science again. Democritus and Epicurus theorized atoms and void. Before we can have microscopes, they were theorizing this stuff using rational thought, and they turn out to be right. Where Plato and his forms turned out to be wrong. There's no evidence for forms. In fact, when we discovered that the universe was so vast, forms is impossible because forms is only relative to our planet. You can't have a form of another universe somewhere. Euclid's Math and Geometry and Logic was the standard textbook for math, geometry, and logic for the next 800 years. Democracy, Constitutional Republics, Spartan Constitution, Lycurgus. The Athenian democracy, Solon, lays out the constitution for democracy from 600 BC till the time Alexander the Great, when the Diadochi sort of break up the democratic institutions that were there. But They had 300 years of democracy, which ends up reverting back to later on when we start to get more developed, more rational thoughts coming back into the fold. Aristotle says that Solon was the first people's champion. And Demosthenes credits Solon for his reforms starting a golden age, which I think is correct. I think 600 BC to 300 BC is a golden age for sure. There was wars and stuff. There was slavery. There was things that I would frown upon. But ultimately, as far as culture, as far as works, and here's why I say that. Homer, Hesiod, Plato, Aristotle, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sappho, Nonnus, the Gospels, Cicero, Tibullus, Xenophon, Herodotus, Arrian, Callisthenes, Callimachus, Theocritus, Apollodorus, Plautus, Pythagoras, Iamblichus, Heraclitus, Democritus, Parmenides, Socrates, Diogenes, Plato, Zeno, Aristotle, Pyrrho, Antiochus of Ascalon, Philo, Proclus, Plotinus. You get Pythagoreanism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Cynicism, Platonism, Stoicism, Skepticism, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism. These are the ideas that are blowing up in a short period of time between the Iron Age and the Antiquity. And then all of a sudden, it's just the Catholic Church. There's nothing, there's no like philosophy. There's no schools of thought. You have like within the Catholic Church, yeah, you have like different types of monks with different ideas, but it's just church. And yes, kingdoms and tyrants did exist, so that is true. But Roman Republic, for example, Lucius Junius Brutus, he sets up a system where they elect 2 consuls every year. They had more of a turnover, more of a republic system than we even have right now, whereas one president every 4 years. They had 2 consuls every year being changed over. So the power was always being moved over. But that sort of got into problems with whoever controlled the military became the emperor. We all know what happened. You mentioned in the first 100 years of 100 BC until Caesar, there was sort of a corruption happening. What Cicero writes about, by the way, my boy Cicero. So what happened then? In 370s, Theodosius shuts down the pagan temples, shuts down the Athens Academy, shuts down all the theaters, stopped funding libraries, shuts down the Eleusinian Mysteries, Samothracian Mysteries, which were around since the Bronze Age, had statues and temples destroyed, massacred anyone who rebelled, including the entire city of Thessalonica around 370, I think it was, the Massacre of Thessalonica, they call it, you can look it up, had all heretics of the Catholic Orthodox faith put to death, put all his economic force into the church, basically ended the classical world as we know it. And I think that's when the real Dark Ages starts. I think it's in the 5th century, not the 6th century. Maybe even a little bit before that. But anyways, Rome was given over to the Goths easily by 476. That was already Rome was already dead by then. There was no Rome at that point in time. Well, at least in the West. In the East, yes, it was different. It was the different kind of Rome. But anyways, I think I made my point clear. You get what I mean. My main argument is exactly what Petrarch says, who Platon agreed with, Machiavelli agreed with. A lot of the great Renaissance writers agreed with Petrarch that it's about the great. What makes how you measure a great civilization is the culture, is the great works, is the poetry, is the theater. Homer, Hesiod, Plato, Aristotle, the philosophy, the thinking. And that's what I ultimately would like to hang my argument on, is the difference in the literature compared to the 500 years before the fall of Rome and the 500 years following the fall of Rome. The only good, I mean, I would love to hear if you have any, if you can prove me wrong on this, but I can only come up with 2 great classic works from this period of time. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which is early on, 525. So we're barely even in the Dark Ages. And then Beowulf's the only classical text that I can come up with that people still write about today. People make movies about Beowulf. You get all that from the classical period. People make movies about the fall of Troy, and people make movies about Euripides. People make movies about Aeschylus. But the only good classical text I could think of from this period is Beowulf. And so that comes way later in the game too. The oldest manuscript we have, I think, is the 10th century. And so it's all theologians. And even between the great Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, that's 4th century to 13th century. So between Augustine and Aquinas, you still have a big gap between great theologians. So even that's rough. And then you have what's his name? It's called the Great Justinian gets called the Great. I don't know why. He was the only good historian of that time period. Procopius said he was a crazy person who walked around and talked to himself, talked to ghosts. He barely reconquers the West for like a few decades, and they lose it again. And then after that, Eastern Rome is just in decline for the next until it fully falls. The Eastern Roman Empire is never back in incline again. You can argue that the Macedonian dynasty, this period right here.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get to Rudyard, though. So,
I thought you said I had 10 minutes.
no, I thought we were talking about 5 minutes.
He literally showed you the clock for when you were done.
Oh, I thought you said 10 minutes. I wasn't looking at you.
No, dude. We mentioned 5 minutes before the show even started.
Just tell me that. My bad.
All right, no worries.
Say 5 minutes.
No, I said 5. When I talked to you, we said 5 to 10 minutes. You could start. You could stop.
Yeah,
early.
but it doesn't matter. The point is, though, that what I'm curious.
Yeah,
what I'm curious about, though, the reason I cut you off before, Neil, is that a lot of this stuff that you're talking about has to do with civilization. One point that Rudyard brought up, which I would love to hear from you before we go back to Rudyard, is what about the individual? How was the life for the individual within these ancient civilizations versus the Dark Ages?
Yeah, I literally don't disagree with anything Neil said. I think that's all objectively correct. I think it's objectively correct that the Dark Ages were a civilizational low point, and anyone who disagrees with that is completely coping. I mean, Western Europe had like no trade system in a lot of the Dark Ages. The cities were smaller. There was no advanced architecture. Everything you described. There's basically like Boethius and that guy from the north of England at Charlemagne's court. Those are the two Dark Age thinkers I can think of.
Roland.
No, not Roland. Roland was a Breton nobleman. I'm thinking of Alcuin.
Oh, yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
And so I agree with that. And I think anyone who disagrees with that is a fool. I do think, though, on a civilizational basis, you could make the argument that the Dark Ages was a better time period to live in. And if you read about the late Roman Empire, you realize it was this completely toxic society that was just predatory. And if you look at the late Roman Empire, last 300 years of the Roman Empire, almost no cultural forms were created. After Plotinus, basically nothing new comes. And there's a great book by Peter Brown, Through the Eye of a Needle, and it's about the world of the fall at the Roman Empire 400s. Hyper-corrupt government. Most people are in grinding poverty. Some people in exceedingly vast amounts of wealth. And if that had stayed on, Europe would have ended up like a social structure like a Latin American country. If you had kept going on, and it's not ironic that like the Latins formed Latin America. It's the Mediterranean Europe's civilizational trajectory continued. So if the Roman Empire stayed around, it would be this weird combination of China, and it would, and on top of that, it would have the bureaucracy and the standardization of China with the lack of creativity combined with the class warfare and low trust of Latin America. Because like the reason the Roman Empire fell, or a very large reason, is just a complete lack of social trust. And I think on the village level, the Dark Ages established a social structure that allowed the future development of Western civilization. The authors like to say the rise of Christianity was this horrible thing, but Rome had very few creative ideas centuries before the Christians showed up. And if you read the primary sources, you find that people would look at a saint's relics and it is spasm in joy. There are so many records of people of Christianity fundamentally just making people's lives worthwhile, because they live in this crappy world with plagues and barbarians, inequality. And I agree that intellectually this was an era that was horrible. And I do also agree that the Christians were complicit in partially killing that intellectual tradition. That being said, more of our cultural foundations come from Christianity than we'd like to believe. And the book by Tom Holland is really good, where, for example, the late antiquity was the period when slavery stopped being predominant in Europe. Once you get to the Dark Ages, in most important West European countries, something like 1 to 10% of the population were slaves. And it was less the closer you were to like France, in the heart of Western civilization. In the Roman Empire, between a quarter to a third of the population were slaves. So slavery got wiped out to a large degree, and slavery was finally abolished in Western Europe in the 1000s. The church banned the gladiatorial games. The church banned sex slavery. They banned treating people rapaciously horribly. Average personal health was better. People in the Dark Ages were the tallest they would ever be between the time of Christ and the Industrial Revolution. And also, this was a period where there was more class and social mobility than before or after, where the leadership structures of Western Europe were not as entrenched as they would be on either side. And so, for example, it was easier to write. There wasn't a stratified nobility or class structure, so you could easily marry into a noble family, which didn't happen before or after. And so you see this combination. And from studies, we found that the things that make people the happiest in life are community and religion. And this was a time period when those two things were very strong. So you'd imagine that people in this society had a generally fine level of life satisfaction, even though their society was falling apart. And you ask, how do you measure health? We measure it based off height and dental quality. And so those two things are a pretty good proxy, because you can look at someone's teeth, and their teeth demonstrate what food they're eating. They were eating more meat in the Dark Ages than before or after. Meat's a luxury food. And also, they were taller. And because genetics has stayed constant in West Europe for thousands of years, so height's a pretty good proxy for the general level of health.
I'm not like doubting that you're getting that from a reputable source. Do you remember where you read that from?
Peter Turchin.
Okay. Now I would push back on that a little bit, because we're talking about the culture, which mainly is religion and community. One of the very few documents that survive from the 7th century, like we have almost nothing surviving from that century. I mean, there's stuff. There's like nothing, like no epics or anything. But they have the Church Council documents from the 62nd canon of the Orthodox. Well, it's still the Orthodox Catholic Church. There's not the split yet. And they decreed that anybody who crushes grapes, so basically any agrarian worker, viticulturist, who crushes grapes and laughs, frivolous laughter, is illegal, because that would mean that you're cooperating with the abominable Dionysus. And my thing is, like, yeah, maybe there was some sort of my question. I guess what I'm saying is, maybe for certain people, life was good. If you were a Bible-believing Christian, life was probably amazing for you, especially if you were in that upper echelon of the economy. But the people who weren't, people who were following their traditions that were laid down to them by their parents and their grandparents, who were, in these areas where there's temples of different gods, this is hell, right?
So heads up, I'm hosting company. I'm going to get going at 3 my time, so in 20 minutes. I set out an hour for this debate. And so what I would say to that is, you're picking a single data point. Let's look at the 20th century. You guys lived in the 20th century. We all know people who lived in the 20th century. And you could pick data points. Maoist China, Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia. The 20th century was generally a pretty good century to live in sanitation, health, wealth, whatever. But you can find specific data points that make the 20th century look terrible. And what I would say there, my reading of what you said, first of all, that doesn't relate at all to quality of life. And the thing with reading church documents of that era is that the church documents are coded symbolism. So what that sounds to me like is crushes grapes and laughs. That was the Dionysian rituals. You would consume ergot wine and then go on psychedelic trips. So it's basically don't do paganism. And from the archaeological data, we found that quality of life for average people was better in the Dark Ages, from the data I spoke of before, because before and after, you had these huge oppressive hierarchical structures. So for the fall of Rome, you would have single families that would control estates in 4 countries. They'd have thousands of acres in Spain, in France, in Italy, in North Africa. And they would travel between visiting them. And that stopped in the Dark Ages because you couldn't have clean transportation. And thus what happened is that you removed this predatory parasitic elite. And it's comparable to how, when the government fell in Somalia, quality of life improved for normal people. And so you removed this oppressive elite, thus more of because keep in mind, productivity is pretty stable across the ancient world, the only breakthrough in productivity in this time period is around 1000 AD with a new type of plow. But so productivity is equivalent across the Dark Ages and the Roman world. And so productivity stays equivalent. You remove the hierarchical structure, and thus what you see is that these communities go on just living their lives. And it's comparable to the Mayan civilization, which crashed at the same time. And for the Maya, their advanced cities and countries, they fell apart and they never formed back together, because for the independent Maya villager, their life was better without the government. It's the same thing for the Sea Peoples, where the Sea Peoples could knock out civilization across the entire Eastern Mediterranean in 1000 BC, because the peasants didn't like the government anyway, because the government just took their stuff and was oppressive. And it's really fascinating, and I think that you can choose to look at the story in a bunch of different ways, and I think both narratives are valid, in that the narrative of, yes, this was a fine era to live in as an individual, and it was a civilizational dark age. I think they're the same thing, because civilization and barbarism are dualities, where civilization allows greater group cooperation for larger projects, but it results in over-socialization and the group constraining the individual. And barbarism allows us to be more in touch with our animal roots and with ourselves as individuals at the expense of collective social development.
Let me jump in right there, because another part of this era towards the end, we have Charlemagne, and obviously it's recorded that he went into pagan lands and converted these lands, and a lot of times massacred these people if they didn't convert. It's in the Song of Roland. They brag about it. This is not like me just making this up.
I hate to be annoyingly. I'm sorry to cut you off, sir. I hate to be annoyingly autistic, but I've read the Song of Roland and I don't remember that.
It's in like 20 different passages where he's sacking the pagans and taking over their cities. That's like half the book.
Song of Roland, Spain.
Song of Roland is Spanish, you mean?
No, the Song of Roland, it's in the Pyrenees. It's so in the Song of Roland, it's the Muslim. It's supposedly Roland, who's a Breton nobleman, part of Charlemagne's army. He's fighting in the pyramids.
No, they use the word pagan for both the Muslims and whoever else.
Yeah, they say that the Muslims are Apollo worshippers, which was a weird conspiracy theory of that time.
Oh, no. Okay, I get what you're saying. You're talking
actually the Basques. It wasn't against the pagans in Saxony. And what I will throw in, I apologize again for interrupting you, is that Charlemagne killed 4,000 to 8,000 Saxons. Look at the 20th century. And again, if we're going to compare our era to then...
Pagan Saxons, right?
Yeah, so he killed 4 to 8 pagan Saxons. It was different from the Song of Roland. Song of Roland is...
Just use that as an example of them bragging about what they do.
But
the Song of Roland is all pagans.
20th century... communism killed like 80 million people. Fascism killed 40 million people. And they gloated about it too. The Nazis and the communists gloated about killing millions of people.
What does that have to
that's
do
the
with
argument? Please continue.
What does that have to do with Charlemagne bragging about?
So, our era has done far, far, far worse atrocities in the Dark Ages.
We're also 10 times the population.
Still, even so, nothing with Stalin or the Nazis are so much more brutal than the Christians in the Dark Ages. There's nothing comparable to wiping out entire social classes. They would kill a couple pagans if they didn't submit, but killing 4,000 to 8,000 Saxons, Saxony probably had a population of like 500,000 people. That's demographically nothing.
There's only 220 million people in the world at this time, in the whole world, compared to billions of people. It's exponentially.
It doesn't add up. I've looked at the numbers.
The numbers doesn't matter. We're comparing numbers.
It does.
What matters is the action of doing it.
If you kill 10 times as many people, that's far worse than killing 1/10 of that.
That's fine. I wouldn't disagree with that. But that doesn't. By pointing to a more worse thing doesn't make the other thing good.
Everything is comparison, and thus we are comparing to the. Let me finish, please.
You're the one cutting me off, dude. They're the one.
I'm sorry for doing that. I apologize.
You
but
cut me off. Let me finish my point, and then you can go. Charlemagne is known for this war as being this warrior anointed by the Pope, starting off this new Western Roman Empire, known for both Muslims, as you pointed out, and pagans in different parts of the whichever area he was in, and this is something they were proud of, is bringing Christendom to the world because God said so. The fact that 1,000 years later there was more people killed under a different regime has nothing to do with how bad or how good this was. What I'm saying, and the reason why I even brought this up, which I didn't even get to, which was the whole reason why I brought this up, is you're talking about if it's a better time to live in. My point is, it's a better time to live in for very specific people. If you are under the Catholic regime and if you're within some sort of higher echelon of society, then it's a great time to live in. But even under Christendom, it's still not the greatest for everybody. People who are, serfs and poor didn't have it that great either. But what I'm pointing out here is my point I'm making here is it's a world set up for a very specific type of person, whereas the world that I'm saying was better in comparison, that I was arguing in my first part, the classical world, people can be more of a choice. There was more of a choice of who you can be in life. You could choose different religions. You can you can follow different philosophies. You can be a Stoic. You could be a Cynic. You could follow Aristotle. You could follow Plato. Whereas in the early Middle Ages, it's just the church or else. So it's very specific on who's going to be thriving in this time period.
I want to make sure that we get to a question Neil wanted to ask regarding democracy and the English.
I would like to respond to what he said.
Sure.
I'd like to respond to his point, and I'm going in 15 minutes. I think the point I'm about to say is important. So everything is based off comparison. When you look at a certain historic society, you're comparing it to other historic societies, not utopia. There's a book called Atrocities by Matthew White, and it's assessment of the top 100 worst atrocities in history. And he compiles all the data from different historians. There are far more atrocities in the top 100 in the classical world than the Dark Ages. And keep in mind, Charlemagne's armies are 30,000 people. The Roman armies are in the hundreds of thousands. So the atrocities in both the medieval, the classical, and the current world are vastly higher than the atrocities in the Dark Ages. You look at the 20th century, it's the same thing where the Nazis or the Soviets or even us, we kill millions of our enemies and we say we're spreading our religion. We're doing it on a bigger scale.
I don't disagree. It's a non sequitur because it's like if I stole money from you, I stole $5 from you. That's bad, right?
What I'm saying is that
is it bad or no?
You can't compare society to You can't compare us to utopia. You have to compare us to other societies in history. So the question of the Dark Ages is, what do you compare us to? Second point I'd like to make.
Classical period. That's what I said in the beginning.
So you actually haven't provided evidence for this. I have provided evidence that
Did you listen to my entire opening thing?
Let me finish the argument. Let me finish what I'm trying to say here. So in the Dark Ages, I provided evidence that health was better, height was better.
You made an assertion.
Also, that slavery. Let me finish. Slavery is a creation of the 11th century. Serfdom is a creation of the 11th century. It doesn't go back into the Dark Ages. And slavery, about a third of the classical world's population were slaves. That had collapsed over the course of the Dark Ages. So average person had left slavery conditions, had not yet entered serfdom with the start of the High Middle Ages. So what you're looking at here is I provided evidence, lower inequality. We know this from various statistics. Lower inequality, lower better health, better height, better diet. You have less of the population in bondage because you don't have serfdom or slavery. Weaker hierarchical structures. So what that signifies to me is quality of life for the average person was better. Also, less atrocities, no conscription.
6.
Please go.
That was 6 assertions with no evidence.
Okay, let me pull up some evidence. So evidence for the
while you're pull up the evidence, and I'm going to
let me pull up sources for each. So
okay, go ahead.
For the height, I'm pulling data from Peter Turchin there. For inequality,
that's not evidence. You just name some guy.
So Peter Turchin's book Secular Cycles covers health. Walter Scheidel pulls up data on inequality. Peter Brown talks about hierarchical structures. Serfdom, Reynolds, both Reynolds and McNeill talk about how serfdom's a creation of the 11th century. And Will Durant talks a lot about this time period. Will Durant, his book, The Age of Faith, covers the macro cultural trends of this time period. Peter Brown also talks about the economic and the social changes. That's a bunch of authors which supply the evidence I just said.
Sure, I'm not even going to sit here and say you're lying. That's fine, but you to provide evidence, you can't just name someone's name. I'm not even.
How would you provide evidence?
Well, my argument was based on the fact that my argument was based on Petrarch's original definition of the term Dark Ages. And can you give me a counter example of any of the classical sources besides Beowulf from the period between the fall of Rome and the period between?
We're not in disagreement.
I know, that's my whole argument. My whole argument is the Dark Ages is based